Good afternoon and welcome. I'm John Goldberg, Dean of the Law School, and I'm truly delighted to be here today to celebrate our colleague and friend, Professor Mark Wu, on the occasion of his appointment as the Henry L. Stimson Professor of Law. Let me begin by acknowledging and thanking all of you who have joined us for this very special day, with a particular shout out to Professor Wu's family members who are here with us here today, his wife Yvonne, and their daughters Audrey and Madeline. Welcome. Also with us today is Ambassador Nicholas Burns, the Roy and Barbara Goodman Family Professor of the Practice of Diplomacy and International Relations at the Harvard Kennedy School. From 2021 to 2025, Professor Burns served our country as U.S. Ambassador to the People's Republic of China. Welcome, Ambassador. Before recognizing our honoree, I would like to say a few words about the chair we are awarding today. In December 1954, Harvard received support from the Ford Foundation to, quote, assist the law school in developing a program of international legal studies, unquote. Its goal was, quote, to help improve leadership in American life by giving Americans trained in law, from whose ranks come many of our governmental, business, and community leaders, a better understanding of and competence in international affairs, unquote. The gift sought to make international problem solving an integral part of the law school's curriculum, and to that end, it established 2 endowed professorships. Henry Louis Stimson was a member of the HLS class of 1890. He served in the highest echelons of government and on the global stage during a turbulent and critical time in American and world history. Among his many contributions, Stimson was U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Secretary of State under President Hoover, Secretary of War under President William Howard Taft, and then again under Presidents Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman. He was also a founding member of the Council on Foreign Relations. A chair honoring Henry Stimson is truly well suited to tonight's honoree. Professor Wu is the faculty director of the Fairback Center for Chinese Studies and faculty co-director of the Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. He previously served as our vice dean for the graduate program in international legal studies. Professor Wu, as was true for Professor Wu, as was true of his namesake, the place of the United States in a complex and rapidly changing global economic, political, and legal order is the question around which all of his work orbits. He writes and teaches in a range of subject areas, including economic security, technology, statecraft, and international law governing intellectual property, trade, and the economy. He is particularly expert on emerging economies, global governance, digital technologies, trade remedies, and foreign investment. His unparalleled expertise on U.S.-China relations places him at the center of what has come to be by far the most important bilateral relation between nations in our times. Professor Wu earned an AB from Harvard, a JD from Yale Law School, and an MSc in developmental economics from Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar. As a faculty member, he has presented his research in fora such as the G20, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, UN Trade and Development, the World Bank, and the World Trade Organization. He is a former member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council for Trade and Foreign Direct Investment and of the advisory board of the WTO Chairs Program. In 2021, while on leave from Harvard, Professor Wu served as senior advisor to the United States Trade Representative. He previously served as a member of the agency review team for the Biden-Harris transition team. Earlier in his career, he served as the Director for Intellectual Property at the Office of USTR, where he was the lead negotiator for the IP chapter of several US trade agreements. While these and other high-level professional activities have taken and continue to take Professor Wu around the world, he is known around here also for his devotion to our students. A rigorous classroom teacher and generous mentor, he has been the recipient of the Sachs-Freund Award for Teaching Excellence, as well as the HLS Student Government Teaching and Advising Award. A dedicated educator, he exemplifies this school's commitment to theoretically rich and practically relevant instruction and to offering our students advice and support that will enable them to develop as leaders in both domestic and international law, business, and politics. An endowed professorship is one of the greatest honors that can be bestowed upon any member of our faculty. As his many achievements clearly demonstrate, Professor Wu could not be a more deserving candidate nor a more fitting occupant of a chair that was established to help ensure that Harvard Law School is well positioned to address vital questions of international trade, international law, and international relations. I'm extremely pleased to be here today to celebrate his professorship, and I now introduce to you the Henry L. Stimson Professor of Law, Mark Wu.
Thank you, Dean Goldberg. Thank you to all of you for coming out on a cold Monday evening to hear about international law. You know, it's hard to draw a crowd to hear any speech about international law these days, and to see folks even standing in back. There are some seats up front, so but it's really an honor to be here with all of you. I especially want to thank Dean Minow, who invited me to join this faculty many years ago. I also want to thank my many colleagues who are here who've inspired me to be a better teacher, be a better mentor, but actually also to push me to put theory and practice together in service of facts in ways to serve our country and also our world. So thank you for inspiring me. It's a real honor and privilege to be here on this faculty. I also want to thank the many students who are here. You all are the future, and we try to shape you. I don't know how much we succeed, but we like to think we are doing a job to become the kinds of counselor statesman that Henry Stimson was, and hold out that inspiration that, as Dean Goldberg noted in his opening address, we live in a turbulent time. We live in a time of much uncertainty, of geopolitical contention, of technological change, of vast socio-economic dislocation. And that's very similar to the world in which Henry Stimson inhabited when he was here at this law school in the late 1880s, and it's the world at which we're sending you off into. And so if anything, I hope in the next half hour or so, I can provide you with a little bit of food for thought about the responsibilities and mission you have facing you. I also want to thank the many people who are here from various different stages of my life. I have people here who I went to undergrad with. Looking here at the front row, including someone who flew in from Hong Kong. So thank you for doing that. I have folks here with whom I went to graduate school with. And I have folks here with whom I went to law school with. And so it's wonderful to see so many people from so many different parts of my life all gathered here. Now I'm going to let you in on a little secret. Some of you have gone around saying congratulations on this chair and so forth. The secret is I've actually held this chair for 7 years. So I think I asked Dean Goldberg this. I think I may have set a record in terms of being able to delay and procrastinate giving a chair lecture. And it's always great to say I hold a record at Harvard, although I don't know if this is the one I want to be proudest of. But also for the students here, you now know who's the softie when you come to ask for an extension. And if I'm bugging you about a paper that's 7 months late, I know what you're going to say back at me now. But the reason for that is when then Dean, now Provost Manning, called to offer this chair, I of course said I was honored and delighted to hold this chair. But I said I wanted to hold off on this while I was engaged in caring for my family. So I wanted especially to say a word of thanks to my family, to my late parents, and especially many of the past 7 years were spent caring for my late mother while she was going through the last stages of Alzheimer's disease, and then also to my wife and to my daughters. for the many times that you've come home to an empty house and had to DoorDash dinner, or to the times when I've darted back to the office late at night, or the weekends when I've been gone, or even when I'm there but not present. So I know it's taken a toll on you all, and I just want to say a word of thanks to all of you. And I also want to extend a word of thanks, especially to Professor Bill Alford sitting back there. Professor Alford was the former holder of this chair. He held this chair for 28 years, and he has served as an invaluable mentor, friend, inspiration. His warmth, his collegiality, his ability to present all sides of a legal question fairly has inspired my own journey as a scholar. So I know these are big shoes to fill. I don't know how well I filled them for the last 7 years. I trust Professor Alford would not have procrastinated for 7 years to deliver a chair lecture, but I hope to do you proud, Bill, in terms of stepping into the Stimson chair. And I also want to take a minute to recognize part of the reason this chair opened up was because Professor Alford was appointed the Jerome Cohen chair, and the late Jerome Cohen, a wonderful mentor as well. Jerry, as many of you know, served on this faculty for many years, played a pivotal role in terms of tying together US-China relations, and also his optimism in terms of the role that international law can play, but also his unbinding ties to thinking about issues of human rights, to human dignity, and finding ways to use international law and the rule of law to advance that. I hope that's something also that I know I can fulfill in this chair. So with all of that, I just want to say thank you all for being here. And what I hope to do in today's talk is to use the journey of Henry Stimson to talk a little bit about what is the role of international law today and how we should think about international law moving forward. And so many of us here think about Henry Stimson as the person who, along with the greatest generation, the team that won World War II, put in place the rules-based, or what we sometimes refer to as the liberal international order, which has held the peace now for 3/4 of a century and counting. And I think that's fair to say, right? He certainly did play that role. But what I want to suggest here is that was not necessarily the natural lesson he would have inferred. And I think there are many lessons that we can see from the arc of Henry Stimson's life that help to inform how we should think about international law today. So as Professor Goldberg alluded to earlier, Henry Stimson served multiple stints in government. He came from a background very different than my own. You know, I'm a child of immigrants from a blue-collar family in the Midwest. He grew up in a upper-class family in Manhattan, went to boarding school at Phillips Academy Andover, and then went to Yale, where he was a member of Phi Beta Kappa as well as Skull and Bones, before coming here to Harvard Law School. And while he was here at Harvard, right, he was inspired to get involved with politics. He came under the mentorship of Secretary Root, who himself, right, had served as Secretary of State and Secretary of War. And he ran for governor of New York unsuccessfully, but then he served, and he served for multiple administrations. And what I want to start this story with is notice the first stint of Secretary Stimson serving as Secretary of War from 1911 to 1913. And this is an era for which, you know, if I ask you what were Secretary Stimson's major achievement in the War Department from 1911 to 1913, right? Even those of you who are eminent scholars of international law, when we talk about Henry Stimson, we're thinking about the later stages. We're thinking about what he did as Secretary of State under President Hoover, what he did as Secretary of War under President Roosevelt, to set up, right, the post-war order that President Truman was then able to construct. But I start with this first phase of him as Secretary of War in 1911 to 1913 to highlight, right, that that was also an era when there was much geopolitical rivalry. There was much interconnected economic trade. There was a time of fast-growing globalization, as there is today, and there was warning signs of possible conflict on the horizon. And we can look at all of this and see that while Secretary Stimson thought America needed to do more in terms of its preparedness, the overall theory of the case of that administration was, we can judge back now, wrong, right? That administration presumed America should focus on its rapid economic growth. There was a lot of contention between the progressives and the trustbusters in thinking about the role of big corporations. And there was a focus on saying, you know, we don't need to necessarily entangle ourselves in foreign affairs. We should be spending our energies at home. And when that theory of the case later proved to be wrong, a few years later, America found itself woefully underprepared. So even individuals, right, who have the best of intentions may have a sense of where trends are going. If the overall government in which you're serving has the wrong theory of the case, right, there can be consequences. Now, it would have been easy today, right, for Secretary Stimson going off into the Wilson administration to say, well, you know, it's their fault. We handed them the right cards. They didn't do enough more there to engage in the kind of bipartisan bickering. And remember, this is a civilian Secretary of War. But what did Secretary Stimson choose to do? Secretary Stimson chose to enlist. So this is the second part of the story that I want to draw your attention to. Imagine today, right, a sitting cabinet member now, right, in middle age, choosing to enlist as an Army officer going off to the front to fight a war while this is under a government of the opposite administration. I think that gives you a sense of both the responsibility that Secretary Stimson felt to this country, but also a sense that, you know, regardless of what political parties we may align with, regardless of our policies, right? When there are dangers facing our country, we're all in this together. And so Secretary Stimson, of course, right, served as an artillery officer. Then he rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in France, was on the Western Front there. And then after the war, of course, we all know the story of the first promise and perils of international law. And this is, of course, the story of the League of Nations, right? The story of making the world safe for democracy, making the world safe for freedom, thinking about, right, how do we deal with all of the various tensions that have built up over the course of time, including the rapid arms buildup from new technologies at the time, naval ships, airplanes, and the like. Now, you know, we can substitute that in with AIs, drone warfare, robotics, right, and the like. But you can start to see the parallels here, right? And so, again, President Coolidge, when she became president, called on Secretary Stimson to serve. He served as Governor General in the Philippines, as you saw earlier. And certainly, I think for those of you who are Asian American in the room, right, certainly the fact that Secretary Stimson was both part of the insular government in the Philippines, which eventually did prepare, although through a contentious process, the independence process in the Philippines, but also later on, right, Secretary Stimson, although having opposed Japanese internment, eventually was the person authorized by President Roosevelt to enact and operationalize Executive Order 9066. Certainly that's part of the story here, but I'll save that for another time, although those of you who've taken Asian Americans in the law with me do know, right, sort of elements of that story. But for Secretary Stimson, for Henry Stimson, right, once he served back in government, he then was asked to serve as Secretary of State, and he did believe in the promise that the League of Nations international law had. He also believed in the promise of diplomacy. And one of his crowning achievements was, of course, pulling together the rising powers, the established powers, together to put in some limitations on the use of then the new naval technology. This was the second of multiple conferences which have been put together in which there were some limitations that were put in, and you can see Henry Stimson there as part of the delegation. Right here, that went off to London to negotiate all this. And you might think, this represents the success of the promise of international law, of international rules, international order. But of course, this treaty and the success of international law was quickly undermined. And that was undermined a year later when we saw Japan invade Manchuria. We saw, of course, Japan take over a region which was recognized by the world at that time, although there have been many concessions as part of the territory of the Republic of China. And you can see how quickly, and what a one fell swoop this was, even though this contravened the rules-based order at the time, of the League of Nations. And so again, here we can see parallels with our time when we have international law, but we have countries choosing to move to change borders because of resources or because of where they view historically territory that they view as having been parts of their either their territory itself or part of their sphere of influence. And so it's this part of the story here where Henry Stimson, again, as I mentioned, his background's very different from my own, but where his story starts to intersect with mine. And so it might intersect in some ways that are a little bit unexpected. Secretary of State Stimson at the time was charged with thinking through the United States' response. And he did so from this house in Washington, D.C. It's on the higher parts that gets a nice breeze. It was known at the time as Woodley, but the intersection here with my own family stories, I see my daughters talking about this is also where many, many decades later, I then went off to parent-teacher conferences because this building here, which was the where Secretary of State Stimson crafted the response, later was donated to his alma mater, which was then sold, which is where my daughter went to school when she was in Washington, D.C. And so Secretary Stimson's response was something known as the Stimson Doctrine. And so the Stimson Doctrine may or may not be known to many of you, but I trust for most of you, even the most ardent scholars of international law, the Stimson Doctrine is one that does not necessarily feature in our public international law discussions today. So I want to spend a few minutes on the Stimson Doctrine, but the Stimson Doctrine is just very simply, a doctrine that the United States articulated at the time that it will not recognize territorial change brought about by force alone. And so this was the adamant response that Henry Stimson put forward, and I'm just going to read a little bit an excerpt from Henry Stimson's own words as he articulated the Stimson Doctrine. He said, "The American government cannot admit the legality of any situation de facto, nor does it intend to recognize any treaty or agreement which relate to," and then he added a whole bunch of other things which tie in more to early 20th century arrangements, so I'll skip that part, but which relate to sovereignty, independence, or the territorial and administrative integrity of the country which was invaded, at the time, the Republic of China, or to the international policy relative to China, commonly known as the open door policy, and that it does not intend to recognize any situation, treaty, or agreement which may be brought about by means contrary to the covenants and obligations of international law, even if those covenants and treaties are concluded between the aggressor state and the invaded state themselves. That is the essence of the Stimson Doctrine, and I think it's one worth thinking about again today, where we again have countries seeking to assert territorial claims of sovereignty or to challenge the administrative integrity of various territories all around the world. Now, of course, Henry Stimson articulated this, but you all know how this story played out, right? In one world, we might say, and maybe this is part of the reason it doesn't feature as much. It wasn't like the Monroe Doctrine, where once President Monroe said this then became the rule, and so on and so forth. Instead, Henry Stimson articulated this, and months later, we have, right, this headline. Yet another country invades and challenges the territorial integrity of another, this time Italy invading Ethiopia and taking over. And then we also know how this story continues to unfold. It unfolds, right, with Japan not being satisfied with simply its claims in Manchuria, but sweeping down to claim much more of China, including, right, including a mass incident of killings in a city where my father was lucky as an infant himself to have escaped the fate of many others by simply fleeing before that invasion came about. It came about with a mass invasions in other parts of Europe that challenged, including some who said, we should accommodate for peace for our time. But overall, we saw that the Stimson Doctrine, articulated as it was, built out as a principle of international law, did not have much force or effect at a time when sovereign actors felt challenged and felt that they had the ability to use force to take the world's geopolitics into their own hands, and that they could do so without consequence. So I think it's worth noting, right? So here we are with Henry Stimson, first time around having served as Secretary of War, not having necessarily prepared the United States for the decade to come, including preparing its war preparedness of fighting its first major conflict in World War I on foreign soil. And then here, Secretary of State Stimson, using diplomacy to the best of his ability to try to curtail the use of new technologies for warfare, as well as, right, imposing a doctrine of international law from, at the time, right, the most powerful economic actor in the world, and not having that be any consequence. Which leads me to, finally, Secretary Stimson's third stint in government. So all of this unfolded. He left government after President Hoover's administration ended, watched all of these horrors unfold. And in 1940, President Roosevelt reached out to Secretary Stimson to ask him to serve as Secretary of War. Again, here was a Democrat who reached out to a lifelong Republican to ask him to take on arguably the most important portfolio in the cabinet in a world that was already at war, and in a world where war preparedness was absolutely critical. And it's this phase of Henry Stimson's career that we perhaps associate most with him. It's this phase that we think about his successes. When we think about why do we have an international law chair endowed in his name, it's because of what he accomplished in those 5 years. And it's also as a result of what he put in place of the post-war order. So after 5 years of very bloody conflict that affected many families around the world, including my own, right, where my grandfather died during this war, we can see, right, sort of the successes that come about from all this, and the post-war international order that we talk about being in peril today being put in place. Now, of course, at the heart of that order is this organization, the United Nations, right? But what we put in place in 1945 and in the post-war order is a different conception than what I would argue was put in place with the League of Nations, or what was attempted to be put in place in the 1930s. So having learned the lessons of all this, what I want to argue here today is that there is a much more nuanced version of international law that involves multiple elements of how we think about international law that I want to disaggregate a little bit. And at the heart of doing that, was a geopolitical rivalry that was already becoming clear when this war ended, that there were major powers with different political and economic systems that were not necessarily compatible with one another, that were challenging each other in different parts of the world, and how would we use international law to make the world safe in that era? That's the challenge that they faced back in 1945, and you all can decide whether or not that's the same challenge that you face now 80 years later. But I would argue, right, that history, while it doesn't repeat itself, oftentimes does rhyme. And so I think it's worth thinking about where are the similarities and differences. And what he put in place in the post-war, what we sometimes refer to as the liberal international order, I want to argue consists of three different parts. One is, of course, international law, and this is where sometimes I hear from students, well, what good is international law? All it does is sort of basically say a few things, but it doesn't really carry any force. And so we certainly do see, right, that as this rivalry was playing out between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc or the Communist Bloc, right? We do see organizations that are set up basically to allow for expressive internationalism. And so these are when resolutions get put out, but they don't have the weight of force of actually some type of binding dispute resolution of this sort. And of course, this is similar to what one might say was the case of international law from the two eras previously. And so there's some continuity here. But there was also put in place a set of what I would call interface rules, right? A recognition that these two systems are different, and we just need to accept that they are different, but we need to have some ways for these different systems to interface with one another. And at the time, there was also a sense, right, and it was not only about the competition between, right, sort of the Western Bloc and the Soviet Bloc, but also managing the decolonization, the independence efforts that were coming about and the various different regimes that were coming about there. So also a new type of interface rules, not just between, right, sort of these two rival blocs, but also between what were the old colonial or metropole powers in these newly independent states, both with their old metropole, but also amongst each other, right? So a set of new interface rules that came about. And then I want to focus on, and this is the focus of the talk, right? I think the lesson that Secretary Stimson and others who came out of the horrors of the 30 years when international law did not effectively work, that it led to two wars, was they put in place a regime of security internationalism. And that's the theme here of this lecture. And I want to sort of unpack what I mean by security internationalism a little bit. So I'm going to go back to the area that I think many of you know me most for, which is international trade and my scholarship there. So I want to show you this picture here of Bretton Woods, right? We think of Bretton Woods as the birthplace of this modern international economic order. And here at Bretton Woods, right, we think of Bretton Woods as oftentimes being shaped by the views of the American delegation as well as the British delegation led by Lord Keynes. But I want to draw your attention to something here about Bretton Woods, which may or may not be obvious to you, which is, notice here, this is the Soviet delegate and this is the Yugoslav delegate. So Bretton Woods, right, was like many other conferences, right, one where all of these rival blocs, some of the newly independent nations, right, some old established colonial powers, they all gathered with the view of trying to shape, right, some type of rules to govern the new international economic order to come in the aftermath of World War II. But what was created in the aftermath of Bretton Woods, we know, right, is of course the International Monetary Fund as well as the World Bank. And then there was the failed third end, which those of you who've taken international trade law with me know about, which is the International Trade Organization, which never came to be, but which resulted in what was eventually known as the GATT. And notice here, what I want to show you is the founding membership of the GATT. And the founding membership of the GATT, right, for some of you who may not know your Cold War history that well, you might say, oh, it also still includes a couple of Soviet bloc countries, or what were eventually become Soviet bloc countries, right? It included Cuba, China, Czechoslovakia, and the like. But if you think back to 1946, 1947, right, notice who is missing here, right? The USSR, Yugoslavia, and so forth. And when we think about these other countries, right, Cuba had not yet had its revolution. China was still ruled by the Republican of China and was still in the middle of a civil war. Czechoslovakia had not yet tilted over. In fact, there were elements in Czechoslovakia fighting very hard not to tilt towards the Soviet bloc. So eventually what they decided to put together to govern the rules of the international economic order, what would be what we would refer to today possibly as a coalition of like-minded states, right? But what was here was a sense and recognition that international law needs to enhance security, and security is contingent upon economic security, and that economic security can only be shaped with other countries who share a system and a set of values that are similar to one's own. Now, of course, we know, right, that over the course of the next 3 decades, some of these countries would veer off into different economic systems. Some of them would veer off into different political viewpoints. This was not a coalition that would necessarily hold together, but that was sort of the premise of thinking about the relationship between the rules governing the international economic order and thinking about how that relates to the geopolitical order, and also recognizing that in other types of foreign international law, say, for example, at the United Nations and elsewhere, right, there are other ways, right, of making sure that this is not a complete bifurcation into 2 different worlds, but that there are times when the world as a whole needs to have a set of collective expressive actions and a set of interfaces between these 2 different systems. So it's this history, right, and it's Henry Stimson's own long journey to security internationalism that I want to draw to your attention, because I think oftentimes today we just think about this as one set of liberal international order rules, right, that sort of tie everyone together, whose main purpose is designed to serve as interface. And so what I put together here is a little bit of a schematic or diagram to suggest, right, if you think about international law on one dimension, as vacillating between having a set of very formal rules as opposed to very flexible rules, right? And on another axis, if you think about, right, the actors that are within that order as being pluralistic and perhaps heterogeneous in terms of their own values, as opposed to being values aligned, right? What they put together in the post-war order, right? Again, here are the same 3 boxes that I showed you earlier, right? Is a set of rules that are expressive and that are international, that are flexible for countries, and that accommodate a set of countries with very, very different systems, different political viewpoints, different economic regimes, and so forth, right? And then the rules, which tend to be more formal, are the rules which are designed to allow for interface between those systems, whether we're talking about between communist or socialist countries and different forms of capitalist countries, right? So, or whether we're talking about newly independent states, post-colonial countries, and various different colonial orders and so forth, right? There's a set of interface rules that tend to be a little bit more formalistic. But what we also have, and what we see with the GATT and other types of orders, is we also have a set of flexible rules for countries who are values aligned. And that's what I refer to as security internationalism. And that type of security internationalism, right, the version that I showed you earlier was where they all shared a set of common economic systems, right? So you could argue that's a deeper set, but it can also be something quite shallow, right? It could be, right, a set of values that we have, even though we differ in our political regimes and so forth, with regards to how we should govern the future of nuclear weapons, right? So, so there, you know, on the one hand, right, you could see, right, something that was eventually created like the Wassenaar arrangements, right, and so forth, which are countries, right, who are thinking about their security, and they're aligned, but they're aligned on a very, very narrow set of values. And then what you have there is a very narrow treaty that is flexible, that's designed to do that. But the argument that I want to show you here is that to say, if we only had the gray and orange or yellow boxes up there, right? Without the blue box, the international order by itself does not necessarily hold together. And that's what we saw earlier in previous generations, right? And it was the focus on making sure that we do have these treaty regimes that allow for international order, that allow for security, right? That is the key lesson that we should be drawing from those who shaped this order back in the late 1940s. Now, this, right, suggests on the one hand, right, those of us today who think we can go at it alone, right, that does not necessarily bode well, but also those who think, right, that what you need to put together is sort of rules that one-size-fits-all rules that accommodate all, right? You can do that, but you also need to have rules which enhance security. And that security internationalism takes on a different form when we're talking about economic arrangements, trade arrangements, investment, export screening, as opposed to AI technologies, as opposed to dealing with other issues that might get at what you think of as security. And I think the challenge that we face today is while this was the order that was created in the aftermath of World War II, what we're used to thinking about, because most of us grew up in the aftermath of the Cold War, is not this, but actually something that looks more like this, right? Because in the aftermath of the Cold War and in the triumphalist moment of the 1990s, there was a belief that international law could be used as, right, a building block to help cajole, change, and move the world, right, towards a set of harmonized, aligned economic systems. And it would also then perpetuate a set of political changes, right, that would then make all of us operate in worlds that are very similar from one another. Certainly, technology has meant that we are much more similar across countries, but this experiment that I argue, right, of what you think of as using values-aligned treaties, right, with very formal rules to push for values harmonization, we are seeing the limits of that because obviously many of these great powers and also former colonial states don't want to be told by more powerful countries that, you know, you should become just like us, especially when some of the atrocities that come from the previous century are yet still unresolved. So the focus today has been, right, that so much of international law and so much of what we've invested in sometimes confound with the liberal international economic order has been tied up with this vision of values harmonization and using multilateralism to push for a set of harmonized or at least aligned rules as opposed to a set of interface rules or perhaps just simply a set of flexible expressive internationalist arrangements that I think is the challenge. And so the challenge that I want to suggest to you is that the lessons that at least I infer from the experience of Secretary Stimson, in which I think you're moving into a world that looks similar to his, is that we need to be focused on recreating these types of arrangements of security internationalism. In other words, when we go about shaping international law, we need to be asking ourselves, is this treaty making all of the actors feel more secure? And if so, right, can we do so in a way where or do our values align on that? And how do we preserve a set of flexible arrangements such that when technology comes about, when values shift and so forth, right, we can still have the ability to preserve our security while still creating this type of international exchange with one another. I think that is the challenge, right? And that is a lesson that I think Henry Stimson took, right, several different stints in government, several decades, right, to learn before getting all this right and preserving the order that we have today. And I want to suggest, right, that that is a much tougher challenge than we might think, because the world that we have is very different and perhaps more difficult to bring about this type of security internationalism than the one that those at Bretton Woods faced. First of all, the world does not divide up very cleanly into blocks, nor does the world want to divide up into blocks. So we can think of, right, countries on this side and this side in a set of non-aligned states. That's the world that we think about from the Cold War. But I think what's new in this world is we also have a set of countries that I would describe as bridging states, right? Countries that want a security arrangement on this side, but want to interact economically on this side. Countries that want to have platforms from this side, but want to be able to conduct e-commerce with this side, right? So these types of bridging states are ones that international law has not really accommodated. But I think one of the challenges that all sides face is being able to discern who is actually a true ally as opposed to who is a bridging state. Because there are countries, right, and I want to differentiate bridging states from non-aligned. Right, non-aligned kind of says, I'm not going to choose sides. I'm going to sort of deal equally with all different sides. Bridging states actually, right, don't come from a principle of non-alignment, but they sort of tilt one way or the other as is necessary for their own security interests and also for their own economic interests and so forth. And so how do we deal with all of that? So I think that's the first challenge, right? In a world where there was simply Block A and Block B, or Block A, Block B, and non-aligned, it was much easier to craft rules than in a world where many countries, big and small, want to serve as necessarily bridging states, right? So they want a security arrangement with the United States, but they also want to be able to import oil from Russia, for example, right? So how do we think about, right, are those compatible or not? The second is, of course, back in the 1940s, we did have a world with integrated economic production systems and technologies, but then that was destroyed by the war. So we had a chance to sort of rebuild those and put up new barriers and so forth. And so hopefully we don't need for that to happen before we think about how do we make our international law arrangements more secure. But we are dealing with a world where there are lots of fixed investments, and we know that investors with fixed investments don't like to see their returns diminish from that. We know that there are technologies that are best in class that are being devised by innovative minds on all sides of all this. And we live in a world where many of these technologies are disaggregated, open source, very easy to sort of to flow from one place to another. And so how do we think about building a world where the challenge is not necessarily containing nuclear technology, right? Although that's important still, but where that harm can come about, right, in one algorithm with a different set of data that could be built up over a set of time, where we think about, right, different types of life science technologies or economic production systems with different types of choke points and the ability to sort of see what's going on at all times. How do we deal with that? And then the third thing is one that I think we are experiencing here today, but I think I would argue is going to hold true of many, many other democracies around the world, which is this is a time just like the one that Secretary Stimson lived in, of intense technological innovation, intense dislocation, and also intense rivalry. And so that leaves a sense of uncertainty and fluctuating interest preferences. Now, if you're an autocratic country, you can just sort of place a bet on one set of views, and you can get the theory of the case wrong, as I suggested, and pay a cost for that. But you at least have a theory of the case, and if you get the theory of the case right, you also have the benefit of scale and time, right, to actually gain from all that. But in democratic countries, you're shaping international law where there's fluctuation in your own interest preferences. So a country that you think of as an ally today may not necessarily be an ally tomorrow, may become non-aligned, may actually become a bridging state with a new regime, only to flip back with the next parliamentary election or the next presidential election. And so I think that also makes it more difficult to think about how do we go about crafting security internationalism. So I think some of you might be saying, great, you've laid out all the different challenges. So what do we do about all this? Right? So what do we do about all this? So I'll leave you with sort of three ideas, but what I hope to do more so than anything else is to inspire all of you to think about, right, what are the types of solutions that we should think about here? Right? So one idea is, of course, certain of these challenges are truly existential, and certain of these technologies truly pose existential threats, whether we're talking about right, certain types of digital technologies, or whether we're talking about pandemic life science type technologies, or whether we're talking about effects that come about from atmospheric change induced by climate change or elsewhere, right? They do have catastrophic type of effects. We can debate which falls into an existential category versus which do not. But I do think, right, that on these narrow values aligned bases, right, we need to look for security arrangements that are flexible, but yet align in a very sort of a concrete set of issues to deal with the challenge at hand, right? And I think if you look back to the Cold War, you can see many examples where that was done successfully with various forms, not just nuclear technology, but other forms of technologies that did allow for, right, sometimes absolute bans, sometimes information exchange, sometimes monitoring systems and so forth. And so how do we think about building those? That's the first thing that I just want to suggest, right, is a form of security internationalism. The second, though, is, of course, structuring economic relationships and recognizing the interplay between economic integration and security, and structuring those to take on various different forms so that you have one set of trade arrangements with one set of countries, you have a different set of trade arrangements with another set of countries, and you have rules that are flexible enough to accommodate for different types of arrangements. And you also have rules which allow you to shift that balance when the polity should make a different political choice in another country. And so we have started to innovate with this, right? We have started to see different forms of trade, investment, export control, cooperations across different countries. But I think where we haven't seen is as much of that sort of flexibility that's built in to say, what happens if A or B or C deviate on this? And how do we continue to keep them in this regime, or do we have a different type of relationship within that regime? And I think there's more experimentation to be had on that. And then the third thing is, I think those of you who've taken class with me know, one of my own areas that I've very much thought about is how do we think about origin rules? But I think in a world where it was very simple to say one ship was built all in one country, or even one car was built in one country, it's hard to say what is built ever all in one country anymore, and what's put together. So in a world that is as integrated as it is, how do we think about these origin rules, and what types of responses do we have with different parts, with different types of components? And I think it's, for myself, I think it's very hard to think about this truly from an ex ante. We can anticipate every type of situation. And so having ex ante rules may not be the right type of approach, as opposed to thinking about this from ex post liability rules. Thinking about what is it the danger that we wish to contain, how do we put liability in place, and how do we induce actors to then use those liability rules to behave in a way that enhances our security up front, as opposed to trying to anticipate every single set of rules and having those formally contained. Again, right, move towards flexibility, but with liability, as opposed to formalism and ex ante rules. So I leave you with, right, those as some inspiration about the challenges here, but the charge that I want to suggest for those of you who are interested and invested in the future of international law is that international law does have a role to play in making us more and more secure, but it's thinking about how do we build a world with security internationalism that is a challenge that faces all of you. So thank you for
Hi, Mark. That was terrific. Thanks. I mean, a lot of questions I wanted to ask, but let me focus on trade. So you were talking about how rules change over time. I was hoping you could talk about how institutions may change over time as well. I mean, well, WTO may or may not survive. So I mean, we think about some of the Bretton Woods agreements. Maybe they're past their sell-by date. So you talk a bit about sort of the interplay between the rules changes you're seeing, and also how the institutions may have to either adapt or be completely replaced.
Yeah, so if I go back to this slide here, right, I think, right, what we focused on and what we had with, right, the World Trade Organization is a set of binding dispute settlement, which the value proposition being, right, this allows us to separate out economic conflicts from other types of conflicts. It allows us to have a set of rules, right, which deal with these types of conflicts. But as I've suggested, right, the world is not stuck in 1993, 1994, and so on and so forth, right? The world found new economic systems and new economic orders. And so in order for that green box to continue to operate with formal rules, with good binding dispute settlement, right, that set of actors who belong to that epistemic community need to decide what to do about those new arrangements. And that's what I presented, right, 8 years ago in my paper in China Inc. That's also what we wrote about with our green industrial policy questions is, could you get to a set of values alignment about what do you think about China's political economic structure or about different forms of green industrial policy? If you could do that, then of course, right, you could have a set of formal rules. But if you can't do that, then those rules become outdated, and then they start to threaten other people's economic security and eventually, right, people's military security through those dual-use technologies. And so I think it's that initial call up front, right, of is there a common values alignment to deal with the dynamic changes, right? And I just used trade as an example, but we can think about technological changes that are happening in AI or in life sciences. And do we have a set of values alignment about how we should deal with this, right? If so, we can craft about formal rules. If we don't anticipate that that's going to be possible, and that was, right, part of my own controversial claim in my papers that wasn't possible, right? And so some people then said, well, what does that mean? The international lawyer can't come up with an international legal solution for all this? But in truth, right, that is the case, right? What we need to then create is a more set of flexible arrangements that allow people to address the security concerns that are going to come out from these new dynamic arrangements. So I think go back to your question about dispute settlement, WTO, we're going to see some countries that think binding dispute settlement with a set of rules is what's in their security. And so those are going to continue to adhere for that. But there are others who think that having more flexible arrangements without a set of defined rules as to what constitutes a national security exception will be in their security interests. And so they will move toward different type of more flexible type of arrangement between them. And what you will see, right, is sort of a disintegration and more complicated, or what we sometimes refer to as variable geometry as being the norm here in international law. I'll let you hand the mic to.
Right here, so.
Thank you so much, Mark. This is great. I'm curious about the pragmatic politics on the ground in the organizations that produce these end results. So with what you've described tonight, I find it interesting that the coalitions who negotiate the agreements are still premised on the Stimson sort of worldview. I mean, we still see the Africa group negotiating as the Africa group. We see Group A negotiating as Group A, Group B countries negotiating as Group B, and rarely do those coalitions break apart in the UN or in the WTO or other international organizations. So I'm curious about what your thesis suggests when you look at the coalitions in the negotiations of these treaties, and you know exactly where I'm going because we've both been in these rooms. How do you account for the seeming impenetrability of the coalitions that have existed since the end of the Second World War and the kind of need for flexibility that you are describing when the coalitions are so deeply entrenched within the institutional context?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I'm going to give a shorter answer, but this deserves a seminar of its own, right? So I think part of the reason these have become so entrenched over time is economic systems are difficult to shift, actually. So the same set of actors that were powerful, right, back then are similar to the ones who are today, with one notable exception, right, which is China and certain states in East Asia, right? And so, and it's been difficult to accommodate, right, the rise of that new set. But also for many of these other groups, to say Latin American countries, African countries, and so forth, right? The reason they haven't necessarily shifted, despite China throwing billions out on the Belt and Road Initiative and elsewhere to try to gain goodwill, both through soft power and also through economic linkages and so forth, is at the end of the day, my thesis here is you sign up for international arrangements if they make you feel more secure. And these countries, right, sort of band together because that's always who they've depended on for their own security. And they look at these others and they say, I'm not sure that their actions are going to make me more secure or not. I don't necessarily trust that based on past histories, but also this new actor who's coming about, I don't know for sure, right, if they're really so well-intentioned as opposed to they're hiding something of this sort. So it's until that security element is accommodated, right, that we start to see these shifts. But I think if we think back to our own lifetime, during the pandemic, we did see some of that, right? Where during the pandemic, some of what we've been involved in previously, these intellectual property negotiations, when countries took actions that actually made other countries feel more secure about their ability to fight back against the threats posed by the pandemic, these arrangements started to break apart a little bit more. So at the end of the day, right, what I want to suggest to you is we can think all we want about the formalism of all this, but at the heart of it, all of these states and all of us as individuals, no matter what type of society we live in, are still concerned most about security. And so that security element of what international law is providing is needed. It's not to say everything's going to be in that blue box or that should only be that blue box. These other boxes are possible, but you need to create that blue box there of security internationalism. And that's the challenge I think we've waned on. And as we think about what's the threat posed about the challenges to liberal international order, right, we sort of missed the boat a little bit on is what I'm arguing here tonight.
Well, mindful of the time, please join me in thanking You have one more item of business. There's an object here. You'll have no idea what it is.
Hoping it's a robot.
Yeah, I need a robot. If you would like to do the honors and do the unveiling. There is a reception across the hall for anyone who's interested in a little bit of food and further conversation. Thank you all again for coming for this wonderful occasion.